Traditionally, in the American Southwest, there were three ways that organic paint was used on pottery. The first is the black on white tradition you find up in the Four Corners region, Anasazi black on white, such as you would find at Mesa Verde National Park. This was fired in a smothered kiln to keep the oxygen from burning out the organic carbon paint. The second is oxidized organic paint pottery, such as was used to produce Salado pottery here in the southern Southwest in the 1300s. This was fired in an open, oxidizing fire that is very brief to keep from burning out that organic carbon paint. And the third is one I haven't really talked about here before, and that is post-firing organic paint. Paint that is applied to a pot that has already gone through the firing process and then is reheated just enough to carbonize those black designs. In this video, I'm going to talk about that third technique that is used by O'odham and Maricopa potters here in the southern Southwest to create beautiful black designs on their pottery. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how that technique, how that post-firing organic paint technique may be related to earlier oxidized organic paint technologies, and what we can learn in the replication of Salado polychromes from these O'odham and Maricopa potters. So in trying to recreate the organic painted designs on Salado polychrome, I've tried a lot of different kinds of paints to try to get the same effect. The Anasazi replicators up in the Four Corners area have used Rocky Mountain bee plant because that's what some of the Pueblo potters in New Mexico use as organic paint to this day. And that makes sense. I've tried using Rocky Mountain bee plant myself and it works fine. Although I think it's unlikely that potters here in southern Arizona were using a plant that doesn't naturally grow here. More likely, they were using something that is indigenous to this region. So, I've tried other things. I've tried mesquite beans, yucca fruit, sunflowers, prickly pears, all sorts of plants that are native to the southern Southwest. And they all seem to work okay. But what I've never tried is mesquite sap. And that is what these O'odham and Maricopa potters are using for their post-firing organic paint. And that may be a clue as to what was going on in the 1300s in this area. So there's this really great book called Dirt for Making Things, which explains the Maricopa pottery making tradition and techniques really well. And I'll put a link to that down in the doobly-doo if you're interested in that book. So let me quote a little piece from this book explaining how they make their paint. And then I'll take you with me down to the river where I went to collect some of this mesquite bark a few days ago. And then we'll go back to my studio where we'll turn some of this mesquite bark into paint, and then we'll try applying that to a Salado replica. And we'll talk a little bit about how this current day O'odham and Maricopa tradition of using mesquite sap may be related to an older Salado tradition of 700 years ago. The next day promised more blue sky, crisp December weather. This time, both Mabel and Barbara awaited my arrival. We were going to decorate the pots and fire them a second time. On the table, a covered glass jar containing black paint was the only material I hadn't seen before. The paint is made from boiling pieces of mesquite bark in water, Mabel explained. Come with me, Mary. I'll show you where we get it. We walked to the stand of mesquite trees that bordered the desert just south of her house. She picked off bits of black bark, collecting several pieces as she talked. This happens in places where the sap runs out of the tree and down the branches and trunk. We just boil the bark in water until it gets thick enough. Then we test it on an old pot to make sure it's just right. That's all. Evidently, the mesquite bark is saturated with enough gum to serve as a medium for the pigment. This plant extract is in a class of carbon paints always applied after the first firing, and then refired just long enough to char the organic substance. It is readily burned out in this firing and results in a uniform satiny black. Mabel poured the paint from the glass jar into 3 small containers. I watched her select a pot and simply choose a design from one of the photos I brought, dip her whittled stylus into the paint, and begin decorating the jar. In order for the black paint to adhere permanently to the slipped surface for the decoration to be set, the pot must be fired a second time. Now it was time for the magic of that refiring. Barbara built another mesquite fire, again letting it burn down to a bed of coals. This time we placed the decorated pots directly on the coals, turning them carefully with a pitchfork at 3 or 4 minute intervals so that every painted part of the vessel came in contact with the coals. The whole process of second firing took about 15 minutes. If the pots are left on the coals too long, the paint will burn off and leave a faded black color. So watch them carefully and turn them as soon as you see the shiny black come out. After wiping each pot with a dry cloth to remove ashes and dirt, we were finished for the day. The pots were ready for market. I bought the scorpion jar as soon as it had cooled. With my snake, lizard, and scorpion pots packed carefully in a box in the back seat of the Dart, I waved goodbye to Mabel and Barbara. The image of the scorpion in the fire remains burned in my memory. A couple of days ago, I headed down to a local park to look for this mesquite sap and to collect some of that sap-soaked bark from the trees. So here are my thoughts on post-firing organic paint. Yes, post-firing organic paint is technologically different from what the Salado were doing. But it's also similar in that they're using organic material for paint. So we find that practiced among the O'odham, who a lot of archaeologists think were probably not the ones making Salado polychrome, in that most Salado polychrome was produced using the coil and scrape method, and the O'odham traditionally used paddle and anvil. So the thought is that a lot of the people that were making Salado polychrome were these immigrants from up north, these Puebloan people who were moving south at that time. So let's take one line of reasoning. Let's say that the O'odham were not the ones making Salado polychrome. Then after the big breakup of 1450, when everybody left this area, those people may have been left without decorated pottery. They may have then gone to recreate decorated pottery and knew to use organic material. Maybe even they knew what the material was that the organic paint was made from. But they didn't have access to that special white slip, so they tried it on their regular brown clay or red clay or whatever they had, and it didn't work. And thereby, they developed the post-firing way of doing it as a way of creating decorated pottery in that post-1450 world. Okay, here's another way of looking at it. Perhaps the O'odham were making Salado polychrome, but after that 1450 breakup, they no longer had access to the white slip. So they were trying to create decorated pottery in the way they had been making decorated pottery previously, and developed the post-firing way of producing it as a way of continuing that legacy. Either way, I think it's possible that the use of mesquite sap as the organic paint may have been some sort of cultural memory from the Salado period when organic paint was used pre-firing. I think it's at least as likely that they were using mesquite sap down here as it is that they were using Rocky Mountain bee plant, which doesn't grow within 150 miles of here. So I'm going to try making some and see how it does, see if it can outperform some of the other materials that I'm using for organic paint now. All right, so this stuff has been cooking on and off for a couple days, but it hasn't been cooking for a couple days straight because I want to keep an eye on it. I don't want it to cook down and be, you know, a burned layer on the bottom. But it's getting fairly thick. I'm not sure if it's good enough to paint with or not, but I'm going to give it a shot. So I've got this Salado replica pot that is just about ready to paint. It's all dry, it's been slipped. And then this, theoretically, is the stuff. So let me see just how thick it is. I'm not sure. My initial observation, you know, compared to Rocky Mountain Bee Plant and other paints of that ilk, is that although it's thinner now, it's thinner than what I would use Rocky Mountain Bee Plant. It has an oily texture that those don't have, which seems to make it kind of stick together better. So I don't know at what texture I should be using this. I only know what I'm used to with the organic paints I've used in the past. And like I said, the texture is a bit different on this. So far, so good. Obviously, I don't have the whittled stick that the Maricopas use. I'm using a commercial brush. But I really like the texture that it paints on with. Very smooth. One thing of note about this material is that it's very dark in color. And I could see why it would be appealing as black pottery paint, because it is almost black in color. Even though it's only forming carbon on the pot, the prehistoric potters may not have understood that. Of the organic paints I have used in the past, Rocky Mountain Bee Plant is the darkest of all. Yucca fruit is more of a golden color. Mesquite bean paint is also more of a light brown color. But Rocky Mountain Bee Plant is very, very dark. Akin to this, it's probably a little lighter, but I could see why perhaps an ancient person would have thought this would make a good black paint. This stuff has a silky texture, such as nothing I've ever used before. All right, I got this little jar all painted. It came out really good, and I don't mean my painting necessarily. I'm talking about the way this mesquite sap paint goes on. It's really smooth. Now, comparing organic paints in the past, I have said that Rocky Mountain Bee Plant, although it's not my favorite organic paint, it paints on real smooth and buttery compared to like mesquite beans or yucca fruit. This is probably a step ahead of Rocky Mountain bee plant for paintability. It's really nice. Now, how well it's going to turn out in the fire, we don't know. The texture is totally different from any organic paint I've tried before. The Rocky Mountain bee plant, and even more so the mesquite bean and the yucca fruit, they tend to be sticky, kind of syrupy. I've compared them on this channel before to like maple syrup that we might put on pancakes. Now this is more oily, and even though it is thinner than I would paint on bee plant or yucca fruit, it went on without running, without dripping, which is related to the textural difference, which I can't really explain except to say that it's a little more oily. It's a little more resinous feeling than sticky, syrupy, sugary as I get from the other materials. So, but it paints really well. So we will see. If, in fact, this stuff turns black, I may have a favorite organic paint because, like I said, it's really smooth. Now, I'm not going to fire this on this video. My next video, unless the weather doesn't cooperate, my next video, next week, will be about how to fire Salado polychromes, how to fire oxidized organic paint pottery, and I will fire this jar in that video. So check that out in a week, and we'll see the firing of this, and then we'll really know how well this stuff works. But to me, it's very interesting to try to relate the current traditions of this mesquite sap painting from people that make pottery differently. There may still be, in my mind, a connection between their traditions of organic paint and the Salado traditions of 700 years ago. I believe that whole idea of painting organic paint may very well have come from up north, came down with the immigrants in like the late 1200s, was absorbed into the local community who were using this imported slip. 1450 happened, everybody moved their separate directions, left this big unpopulated area in the middle, and that trade route was not connecting. They were not able to get that white slip anymore. They couldn't use organic paint in the same way they had, and so they developed a new way to use organic paint. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. It's just speculation and there's no way to prove it, I don't think. If you'd like to learn more about organic paint and using it on pottery, check out this video right over here where I talk more about the details of organic paint and how it came to be practiced in the Southern Southwest. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.